All right, good morning. You know, I forget how good these guys really are. Aren't they amazing? I mean, just the music and the singers and all, I agree. And which is one of the neat things about, if you're not here, you can live stream, so you can watch on live and other people who are watching on live and got to hear the music. And I know Shay is out there also, so we want to say hi to all those and glad that you're here with us. Last week, Josh started the series Follower, and part of what he did was talk about that there's a difference in following Jesus and following Jesus, right? So you got it? You figured it out? Okay, I got it. That doesn't make any sense at all. But there is, you know, there are people who follow to listen and try to learn and say, I'm trying to figure out who he is and what he's talking about and what is it that he's trying to do. And then there are people who follow, meaning they have decided who he is and what he's talking about and what he's trying to do. And they've decided, I'm going to follow that. I'm going to follow him. And there really is a difference in those two. And so we decided to take a look at John's Gospel in the New Testament, just real quickly as we lead up to Easter and talk about it. And if you've already looked in your outline and you haven't gotten up and left, today we're going to talk about follow the wine. Yeah, that's really what it is. It wasn't W-H-I-N-E. It's W-I-N-E, follow the wine. It's one of those things that sort of throws people off because John records that the first sign or the first miracle that was a sign of who Jesus was done in Cana of Galilee at a wedding where he turned water into what? Okay, let me try that again. He turned water into what? Yeah, see, where I grew up, the church would say he turned water into non-alcoholic grape juice. That's what they would say. And it's just one of those things that's interesting in our time, how quickly it can go from one to the other. Because if I got up here and I said negative things and bad things about wine, I probably would have a lot of people get up and leave because the attitude toward it has changed so much. But in Jesus' day, it was a very real thing. This was a part of their culture. This is a part of what they did. And just to let you know from someone, you know, who is not a Greek scholar, but has read just an enormous amount of material, Jesus turned water into wine. He did. That's what he turned it into. And it fit in their day and it fit in their culture. And so here's the first thing I would kind of caution you on, but also tell you to catch this, understand this. First of all, the wine is a sign. And when you start to understand what the wine was, and then you can avoid this problem of getting hung up on the wine. Don't get hung up on the wine. The wine is a sign. The wine is a picture. It says something, and John records this sign or this miracle that Jesus did for a reason. I mean, he was very pointed about why he did certain things. So the wine is a sign, and as I always like to tell people, the sign is not the thing. So don't get hung up on the wine. The sign is not the thing. The sign is the thing that points to the thing. Don't get hung up on the wine. The sign is the thing that points to the thing. So let me give you a couple of things as we're going to look at this, first of all. And here's number one, you might want to fill in the blank. John has a purpose in his writing. When he writes his version of the gospel, it is different than the other three versions. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels. If you want to write that down, you probably, if you've read any kind of commentaries, you will see this word. Let me tell you what it just means. Synoptic means they are similar, or it comes from the word in the Greek, the same. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a similar approach, similar information, and some scholars will even say, you know, one copied the other, or they all took it from another one that is not in here. And so, you know, just to try to relate the commonality of their versions. They didn't include everything the same way, but they had a purpose also. If you go and read the very first chapter, very beginning of Luke's gospel, you'll see Luke says, here's my purpose. John is different. John has a purpose also, but John writes his version of the gospel, and he gets to the end, and there at the end, as I would probably do, he says, here was my purpose for writing. This is why I wrote this to you, why I wrote it in this way to you. And some of it may be that John, at the end of his long book, at the end of this long letter he wrote, realized what he was doing, or could at least clarify it. He could speak it more clearly. Here's why I wrote this. This was my purpose and my plan in writing this, and his is different, which is what makes his version of the gospel different. John is not trying to give you chronology. John is not trying to say, okay, I'm just telling you like a history book, the story. John has a reason that he has written it the way that he's written it, the things he has put in, and the things that he intentionally does not put into the book. Look at what it says. This is near the end of John's gospel. This is in chapter 20, the very next to the last chapter. Incidentally, just to let you know, if you don't know, when they wrote these, they did not write them in chapter and verse. All this was added later so that you and I could quickly reference it. It was just one giant long letter. But here's what he says near the end of this giant long letter. He says, therefore, many other, say this with me, many other what? Now this word would mean, sometimes will be translated attesting miracles. But what it means is he just didn't say Jesus did a lot of miracles. He's saying that Jesus did things as a sign, as a thing that would point to who he is. So there were many other miracles Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which, catch this, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may, and I love this word, don't you? So that you may what? Believe. So that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So John is very purposeful in what he does. He is giving you these signs, these miraculous things that happen, and letting you know that these point to who Jesus actually is. Not that John would ever think that one thing that you experienced or one thing that you read would do it, but knowing that as you sum them up, as you add them up, you would get more and more this idea of who Jesus himself was. He says, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Now, second thing is, terminology or terms can be confusing, right? Sometimes our terminology just makes it more difficult. And in our culture, whenever you start talking in terms like belief, or you may say faith, or maybe you say, someone say you need to receive Jesus into your heart. So you say believe or receive. Those terms can become very confusing. That's why you need to read the whole thing and you kind of catch what those terms mean, because John actually tries to clarify what he is talking about. Josh talked about this last week with Nicodemus, when Nicodemus saying, I don't understand. You say, Jesus, that don't you know as a teacher of the law, a man must be born again. How can he be born again? You can't go back and, enter your mother's womb again. And Jesus said, you don't get it. You don't understand. So these terms can easily be confused or used to mean something that they don't mean in the writing unless you look at them in their context. So here's what John put in the very first chapter, in the beginning of his letter. He says this in verse number 10. Incidentally, this is from the Living Bible, so this is a paraphrase that was written, I guess, in the 70s. It's not a translation. There's a difference. A translation goes to the original languages and tries to translate from those languages into the English. Paraphrases will go to original language and current English translations already and try to put it into some kind of terms and understanding that you and I could catch. And I think this is why the Living Bible was very effective in its day, and I think you'll see that this might help you understand what he was writing in 1 John, or in the first chapter of John. Here's what he writes in verse 10. But although he made the world, he's talking about Jesus, although he made the world didn't recognize him when he came. Verse 11, even in his own land and among his own people, the Jews, he was not, here's one of those words, he was not what? Now he was accepted as a Jew. He was just not accepted as the Son of God, as who he was. That's what he's talking about. They didn't accept him as that. In fact, if you go and you read in John's gospel, you'll see that even most of the people who were very close to him did not accept him in this way. His brothers and sisters, he had half brothers and sisters, they did not accept him in this way. John records in this first chapter that John the Baptist who is the forerunner. He actually records where John struggled, and John was also a relative. He was a cousin, just a little bit older than Jesus. And John states after his baptism, that's when I actually realized who he was. So even his cousin, who probably grew up with him, saw him a lot, didn't accept him. We can relate. If your brother came to you and said, I'm actually the Son of God, you would say, Mom, he's at it again. Here he goes again, because it's just something that we have a hard time grasping. But John later reveals that he did understand that this is who he was. So he says, even in his own land, his people, the Jews, he was not accepted. Only a few would welcome and receive him. He means receive him as the Son of God, meaning receive him as the Messiah. But to all who received him, he gave the right to become, catch this, children of God. Now, someone will say, well, wait a minute. Aren't all people children of God? In the sense that we were all created by God? Sure. Every one of us is a person who is created by God. But he's talking about something different here. He's talking about those that God becomes their father. He becomes the father. It goes right into what he's talking about with Nicodemus, this rebirth, this change that occurs. We were all born physically into the world, but there is a spiritual rebirth, a change of us on the inside once we recognize, understand who Jesus Christ is, who the Son of God is, and we accept him for who he is. We receive him as the one who has come to rescue us. We believe in his name because we know that name signifies someone that is entirely different than all other people. He says, but to all who received him, he gave the right to become children of God. All they needed to do was to trust him to save them. All those who believe this are reborn, not a physical rebirth resulting from human passion and plan. I actually like the way he words this. Not as resulting from human passion and plan, because it's a contrast to God's passion and God's plan, but from the will of God. So he says there's a difference in believing and believing. There's a difference in receiving, accepting, and receiving and accepting. And he's trying to clarify what those differences are. Third thing is, sometimes the truth is we believe too easily. And before I go into the parable about Jesus turning water into wine, this just sort of jumped out to me at the very end, right before this, where after he has dealt with John, it says this. It says, the next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip, he's calling his disciples, and he said to him, follow me. Philip was from the town of Bethesda, where Andrew and Peter lived, so they knew each other. Philip found Nathanael and told him, we have found the man that Moses wrote about in the law, and the prophets also wrote about him. He is Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth. And don't you love Nathanael here? But Nathanael said to Philip, can anything good come from? Yeah. He's like, wait a minute, there's no way that the one we've been waiting for could possibly come from Nazareth. You just know a lot about the area. It's not a good area. This is not where good people come from. This is not where people come in and make huge changes or big. This place is a mess. Is it possible that any good thing could come from Nazareth anyway? And now you're talking about where we found the Messiah, the one that God has promised, and he's from. That doesn't make any sense. Look at the next sentence. Philip answered him, come and see. That's part of that following, right? Okay, just come and see. Check it out. And Jesus said to Nathanael, when he saw him coming toward him, he said, here is truly an Israelite. There is nothing false in him. I love the description as he says this. This is a man in whom there is no guile, one translation says. There's nothing that what you see is what you get. He's straight up. He's honest. I'm sure that this flattered him, that he was thinking, wow, I respect him saying that. Nathanael asked, well, how do you know me? And here you have to turn your outline over if you want to read in the outline. Jesus answered, I saw you when you were under the fig tree before Philip told you about me. Then Nathanael said to Jesus, Teacher, you are the Son of God. You are the king of Israel. Now listen to this response, because doesn't this make sense? Jesus said to Nathanael, do you believe simply because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than that. So it's sort of like this idea, Jesus saying, wait a minute, that was it? That's all it took? I just say, I saw you under the fig tree, and all of a sudden you say, I'm the Son of God? You know, that you believe who your brother says that I am? Doesn't make any sense. And I think that that's true sometimes. I think sometimes we see something, we catch something. For many of us here, you know, I was raised in a church. How many people were raised in a church? Yeah. As I tell people, I had a drug problem. My mom drugged me to church every Sunday, you know, whether I wanted to go or not. I mean, it was just a part of my life, and there are expectations that had to do with that. But the problem with that is you are expected, because you were raised this way, to believe these things when sometimes you've not checked any of them out. You haven't decided for sure whether or not you really believe these things or not. And so your belief becomes very easy because it fits the family and where you are. But the truth is, you're not there yet. You're not ready to grapple with these things yet. It's why some people then, you know, leave the family, they go off to college, or they move somewhere, you know, for the very first time, and they get in with a different group of people, and all of a sudden it appears that their belief or their faith has gone away. It may be that they didn't really have the kind of faith you and I are talking about to begin with. It was just because this is where I was raised and these are the people that I was around. It may be because nothing has ever tested what they believed or their faith. I'm not telling you shouldn't raise your kids in church, but what I am telling you, and maybe you're a person that you've kind of gone through this, is everybody has to go through it. No one can believe for you. Not your parents, not people that you respect. You have to make a decision yourself. You have to grasp it. You have to grapple with it. You have to decide, is this true? And I think, you know, the story of Jesus being raised with his family and in his own hometown, and they didn't believe him. My goodness. And then here we find Nathanael, you know, believes really quickly, because it seems like Jesus has given him a quick little trick. I saw you. I can tell you were under the fig tree. You must be the Son of God. Now, maybe it's because of number of years growing up. Maybe it's just because I was raised in a science family. My family was like that. And maybe it's just my own skepticism. But at this age, you can tell me all kinds of things. That won't convince me. At some point, I'm going to check it out, and I'm going to dig, and I'm going to ask more questions or watch other things, and things that seem just phenomenal. You know, I'm not one of those persons, are you? I'm not one of those persons that quickly grasp it and say, oh, that's it. That's all that matters. And if you're honest, you won't be either. Because you don't want to build your life on just a single event. I read the story of Paul, and you look at Paul, and he has this experience on the road to Damascus, and a lot of people would say, well, he probably told that story forever. This is why I believe, this is why I believe, this is why I believe. He did it first, and he does bring it back every once in a while, but Paul actually goes into his belief, and it's far more in depth than that. Far more studied and chased after than that. And it has to be, because you're going to run into things in life that will contradict your faith, will contradict what you believe, that will challenge you. And if you haven't built some depth, you know, in that, and I don't just mean depth, I mean depth and width, you know, of your roots, then the problem is, you know, they won't stand up to the things that you encounter and that you struggle with. So Jesus kind of challenges them on this, and he says this in verse number 50, do you believe simply because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see, say this part with me, you will see what? Greater things than that. And I think this is Jesus saying, listen, don't be so foolish as to base your faith on something like that. You're going to see a whole lot more than that. And then this leads right into the story that we're going to look at. And I've titled this one, A New Rule, Always Serve the Best. We would think always serve the best first, but in this case, it's always serve the best last. And you'll see why I labeled this story this way. So here's chapter 2, verse number 1. The next day, actually in Some of the little translations, it says 3 days later. It says the next day there was a wedding celebration in a village of Cana in Galilee. So this is a good ways away from where Jesus lived. So he had to travel there for several days, and apparently he travels with his disciples and maybe even with his mother who was there, because it says Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. Then it says this in verse 3. John gets to it really quickly. And John is working under some assumptions that you and I would understand weddings in their day. They're not the same as weddings in our day. The weddings in his day may last all day. They may last 2 days. They may last 3 days. Certainly the wealthier you are and the more that you could pay for your guests to stay with you and meet all their needs, the longer the wedding could last. And in their day, the wedding was not about the bride. It wasn't. They didn't sing, "Here Comes the Bride" in their day. They sang, "Here Comes the Groom." That was just the way it worked. And because of that, it was the groom and his family that hosted and paid for everything, not the bride. I know that there's some people here that you've got a lot of girls in your family and you wish that it was that way. But in his day, it was. That's just the way that it worked out. So as all of these guests came, as they showed up. Also, the other thing is, in his day, if someone showed up and was not invited, their culture said you had to welcome them anyway, and you had to take care of them and be hospitable to them as long as they stayed there also. That was just part of the culture of who they were. So the wine supply ran out in verse 3 during the festivities. So Jesus' mother told him they have no more wine. This might indicate that this was a relative of Jesus, that Mary was there serving and maybe running, sort of like a wedding coordinator, running the wedding and taking care of things. And so she goes to Jesus. He's real quick in the story. The wine ran out. Now, this is disaster in their day. We're trying to be hospitable to all of these people, and we've run out of wine. It's all gone. I don't know if they didn't plan enough. I don't know if they ran out of money. I don't know if more people showed up than they thought, but for some reason it ran out. And so she goes to Jesus of all things, and she tells him, the wine has run out. Look at what Jesus says, "Dear woman." Some of your translations will just say woman, and that would be an accurate translation. My son would often say that to Joni, my wife. He would just call her woman. Yes, he paid dearly for it. That's right. He still has the scars. That was not what this was. This was actually, that is accurate, but it means what is here in the New Living Translation, dear. It is a statement of great respect for her in public as he would speak to her. Dear woman, that's not my problem. It literally, he says in here, this may be a little strange in the Greek, to me and to you. That's literally what it says. And it means between me and you, what does that have to do with me? Why would that be a concern of mine? Why would that be some issue that I would need to deal with? It was an idiom in their culture. Jesus replied, "My time has not yet come." In verse 5, but his mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." So she takes charge, right? She still says, looks to the servants that she is over there in the wedding, and she says, whatever he says to do this. And then look, it says in verse number 6, standing nearby, I want you to catch this because this becomes real important, were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Now this is why this story is so important and why John includes it. For a well-to-do family like this family where the wedding was taking place, they would have these stone jars that would hold a lot of water, and this was sacred territory. These were like icons. They were not used for anything else. It's sort of like when you see in the temple, and it says that there were utensils in the temple. They use utensils in their kitchen. They use utensils in their family. What was different is these were only used for the purpose in the temple. These jars would only have been used for the ceremonial washings under Jewish law that they would deal with. No one messed with these jars or the water that was placed in these jars. So very important because it symbolizes the old system and the way they had always done things, the part that you don't change and that you don't touch and nobody goes there. This is the symbolism of it. And then it says in the next sentence, each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. Verse 7, Jesus told his servants, fill the jars with, say it with me, with what? Okay, fill the jars with water. Made sense. They would have been used to that. Maybe they were empty because all the guests had come and because they had used the water to wash and to prepare for the wedding and to be correct in their preparation. He says, fill the jars with water and take it to the when the jars had been filled, he said, now dip some out. So the servants go over, dip some out, take it to the master of ceremonies. This is the guy who is standing up. He was in charge of the wedding. He's the one that has this incredible problem of now the water has run out. How am I going to keep control of this crowd? So the servants followed his instructions. When the master of ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though, and I love this little footnote, right? Though, of course, guess who knew? The servants knew. The servants knew where this water had come from, and now the master of ceremonies is saying, you know, this is wine. And here's his statement on it, verse 10. A host always serves and he's speaking this to the bridegroom, to his family who would have paid for all this. A host always serves the best wine. Say it with me. What? Yes. Then, when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine, the Boone's Farm, the Ripple, the $2 Chuck. You know, I have no idea. So, you know, but you know that something like that comes out afterwards. There's a reason. It only makes sense. He says, but you have kept the what? The best for now. Wow. It totally floors him. It totally shocks him. This is not the way it's done. It doesn't make any sense at all to me that you would do it this way because no one does it this way. And I don't know if you noticed this, but the bridegroom who he's called up and he says, you know, I've got to say something in front of all my guests here. Everybody saves, you know, the worst wine for last. They use all the best wine. And once you guys have had plenty to drink, and maybe this was, you know, this might have been after the first day. Maybe this is the second day or third day. You know, you've gotten so used to it. Then he brings out the best wine. This guy has saved the best wine for the last. And you notice in the text something that's very clear there. The bridegroom says nothing because he doesn't know what in the world are you talking about, right? He's sitting there going, I've done what? You know what? He has no idea what's going on. In fact, no one knows what's going on except who? Who? Yeah, the guy serving it. See, I think it's so pointed because when it comes to who Jesus Christ is and what Jesus Christ has done and his promises and what he can do in your life, the people who don't know don't know. The people who don't know, they just don't get it. They don't understand. It's the people who know, and the people who know are the ones who are doing what? Okay, I know you know the answer to this one. You know what I'm saying? The people who know, in this case, are the ones who are doing what? Yes, absolutely. Of course they are. They're the ones that know. They know where it came from. They know they poured water into those giant stone jugs, those pots that were there, and they know this guy says this is the best wine, you know, of the whole celebration. Wow. Stunning. It absolutely makes sense. Tell you two quick stories, and hopefully I won't get into too much trouble, but like I said, times have changed, so I probably won't get into as much trouble as I could have gotten into. But I know this is true, that you would do it this way because my dad would, at night, especially in our teen years, he would have a drink at night. So my dad would have a glass, and he would have a drink in that glass. And my brother and I, we were sitting watching TV with my dad. I think we were watching a football game or something, don't have any idea. And I never drank, just to let you know, I never drank, not because I'm so spiritual, or it wasn't anything to do with that. I always thought, I'm out of control enough. I don't need any help in doing this. I'm a character enough. And I was never comfortable around my friends who would drink and become more out of control. And I always thought, that's probably not a good thing. Probably a bad idea. And so my dad one time got up to go into his bedroom and go to the restroom, which was at the back of his bedroom and suite that he'd built. And so he put the glass on the ledge of the fireplace, and he walked through and he closed the door to the bedroom, which was he always did. He would open it and close it. And as soon as he did, for some reason, I was a character enough, I sprung up, grabbed the glass, ran in the kitchen, poured it out, opened the refrigerator, found some apple juice, and added it with water until I matched the color of what it looked like in the glass to me. Then I ran back, put it back on the ledge, sat back down, and we acted like nothing was going on, even though my brother says he's going to kill you. Oh man, you are in big trouble. My dad drank the whole thing over the rest of the night. He, slowly drank the glass and never said a thing. And the next day I told him, I said, Dad, I switched what was in the glass. And I went and got apple juice and whatever and poured it in there, and you never knew the difference. Now, I was making a point. That was me, unfortunately. And I was making a point. You never knew the difference. And he said, oh, no, I knew something was wrong. I was like, oh, no, you didn't, because if you did, you would have done something about it. You would have changed it and all too. So I always knew, you kind of instinctively know, he didn't get it. He didn't understand. I was telling him it's a placebo, it's the same effect no matter what. Another one, years ago, my wife will really kill me for telling this one. I was in San Francisco. Actually, I was at Pebble Beach. And I was meeting there with a lot of ministers and a guy who had started a church in San Francisco. He was very wealthy. He was in real estate, made a lot of money. He had a lot of high-end connections. And I got a chance to meet with a couple of guys who were foreigners, business guys, but they also spent most of their time in the U.S. So I don't know if they had dual citizenship or what. But these guys were new to the faith or new looking at the faith, kind of following to see what it was all about. And I had a chance to go. One of the guys owned his own winery. He actually owned several of them. And so I got invited to a wine tasting test at this beautiful house. It was a $20 million house overlooking Pebble Beach. Yes, and I was there, just to let you know. And Reggie Jackson's house was right behind us. So we blocked his view, and I was proud of it. And so I'm there at this wine tasting test. And I was the only minister that was invited, because the guy that invited me and told him I'm going to invite this guy said it won't bother him. And the guy had no idea what he was talking about. But he knew the other guys, they would probably get up and walk out in the middle of it. So I'm there at this wine tasting test. Okay, before you get mad at me. And and we go through from his vineyards, these wines. And I'm tasting, I don't know if it was 3 different bottles of a white wine and maybe some red wine. The really cool thing about it was he hired a private chef there. And this private chef, she made all sorts of hors d'oeuvres. So, I ate like a king and all. So, but I tasted these wines. And at the end of it, he would ask, okay, tell me what your favorite was. Tell me the characteristics. If you know wine, there are all kind of characteristics of it. You smell it, you drink it, do all kind of things. And finally, privately, he even asked me, you never said anything. So what was I said, I have to be honest with you. I couldn't tell the difference. Now, I'm not telling you there wasn't a difference. I'm not a wine person. I'm not a person that never, drank. So as I tasted each one of them, they all kind of, in a sense, are the same to me. That's so you don't want to invite me to an expensive wine tasting, because it's a waste of time, right? And just let you know, it won't hurt my feelings, if you don't do that. And so I understand the idea that you save the cheapest for last, because you don't know the difference after a while, right? Yeah, you're just like, it's all the same. There's a picture here about life. There's a picture here about what God Himself does and what God Himself is doing. It's not that the best came first. I know we think that. Most of us would sit back and would say, oh, if I could just be young again because the best came first. Really? Seriously? You want to go back to being 15? Seriously? You want to go back to, no, not really, but there are things about it, and sometimes we just kind of fall into that trap of if we could only go back. I know people do this religiously. After tasting of who Jesus is, knowing they go back to the old way. Why would you do that? Why would you go back to the old way? This is so much better. Jesus is making such an incredible change when he comes personally and he changes the flavor of life and the understanding of life. It's just, you have to catch one thing about it. You know who really gets it? It's those who what? Serve. Yeah. They're the ones that get it because they are the ones that understood where it came from. They didn't know how Jesus did it. It doesn't say in the passage that Jesus prayed over it, that he laid hands on it, it doesn't say anything like that. It just said he told them, fill the jars, okay, now go take some to the head guy. That's all it says. But what they understood was that's the guy that did it. That's the guy that made the change. And the change wasn't worse. The change was much better. I mean, if anyone knew that wine was now in those pots, oh my goodness. But that's exactly what he did. That's exactly the change that Jesus himself made. Here's how it finishes. It says in verse number 11, he says, this miraculous sign, it means a sign of who Jesus was. Don't get hung up on the wine. It's pointing to who Jesus is. At Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, what he could do. And his disciples believed in him. Now, if you go in and read John's gospel, you'll say, well, there's some other places that say they didn't exactly believe in him. You're right. They believed from this one sign something about who Jesus was, but they were going to see many others. They were going to see a whole lot more of what Jesus was capable of doing. Oh, by the way, I did put a poem in here. Does anybody like poetry? This is Robert Browning. My dad loved poetry. And this was published in 1864 where Robert Browning, I thought it was just interesting because I remember this one my dad would quote, grow old along with me. Isn't that a great phrase? The best is yet to, say it with me, be. Yeah, grow old along with me. The best is yet to be. The last of life for which the first was made. Our times are in his hand who saith, a whole I planned, youth shows but half. Trust God, see all, nor be afraid. I think I think so many times we just miss the fact that what Jesus was doing was moving things forward. He was changing something that God had planned all along, that he would make those changes. And we get hung up. We can't walk away from the first part of life. Somehow we just sort of fall in love with something that's really not worth holding on to or that. You can't hold on to it anyway. And we forget that God has such wonderful plans ahead. We're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. And would you pray with me as we prepare? Heavenly Father, we thank you that you do have plans. And even when Jesus came, Jesus showed us signs of who he was so that we would know that we could believe him, we could accept him and receive him as who he was, as who he was claiming to be. We could put our faith in him. We could put our trust in him for the future, for what is coming, because of the things that he did, the things that he said. Not just one thing, but because of so much that Jesus said and did. Father, we know that Jesus came and gave his life to pay a price for our sins so that we would be made free, we would be made whole, we would be cleansed. And Jesus walks out of the grave 3 days after his crucifixion to show that the promises that he made are true, that he had conquered death, he had conquered sin for us. And it's that one event, Lord, that has made such a change in our lives and in the world around us the past 2,000 years. Lord, thank you for the signs. Thank you for the things that are recorded. Thank you that somehow you prompted John to write these things down so that we would know what you want us to know. We would hear the things you want us to hear, so that you would still be speaking to us in our lives here and now from something that you caused him to write down 2,000 years ago. If you're here, you've never received Jesus. You've never accepted him as who he says he is. Never believed that he was the Son of God. Never put your hope and your trust in what he did for you and what he promised you. You know, the thing I would encourage you even today is follow. See who he is, what he's really like. Build your hope and your faith not just on some passing fancy, but something that has been active and working and powerful and changing lives for 2,000 years and continues in all cultures and lands and places where the message, the good news about Jesus Christ, is proclaimed and heard. Lord, now as we come and we remember the sacrifice that Jesus made, and then he made it so that we would not be the same. We thank you in his name.